Sophia Drake had always been the kind of person who approached change with caution, analyzing every possible outcome before making a move. It was what made her good at her job as a paramedic, thinking 3 steps ahead, never letting emotions cloud her judgment. That same mindset had carried over into her personal life, especially now as she stood in the driveway of her new home, gripping the handle of her suitcase a little too tightly. The house was nothing special, just a modest single-story place with faded white paint and a porch that creaked under her weight, but it was hers. After years of renting, of moving from place to place, of feeling like she was constantly in transit, this was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where she could breathe. The neighborhood was quieter than she had expected. Too quiet. It wasn't like the suburbs she had known growing up, where kids played in the street and neighbors chatted over fences. Here the houses sat further apart, their yards separated by tall hedges and aging wooden fences. The street itself was nearly empty, no cars passing by, no sound of distant laughter or barking dogs, just stillness. She had barely taken a step toward the front door when she felt that unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly she turned her head, scanning the surrounding houses, and that's when she saw him. A man stood on the porch of the house next door, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. He didn't wave, didn't offer a polite greeting, just stared. His posture was stiff, his gaze unwavering, and something about the way he stood there, like he had been expecting her, like he was waiting for something, sent a flicker of unease down her spine. Sophia forced herself to offer a small nod, a polite acknowledgement, but he didn't react. He just kept watching. She turned away, shaking off the discomfort, and focused on getting her things inside. It was normal for neighbors to be curious when someone new moved in. Maybe he was just one of those people who didn't trust outsiders. Either way, she wasn't here to make friends. The house smelled like dust and neglect, like no one had truly lived in it for a while. It wasn't abandoned, the previous owners had left just weeks ago, but there was a certain emptiness to the place, a stillness that made her uneasy. She busied herself with unpacking, pushing away the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. But it was hard to ignore. Because even inside the house, with the door locked and the blinds drawn, she still felt watched. The first night was restless. She told herself it was just the unfamiliarity of the new space, the way every creak and groan of the house settling felt amplified in the silence. But then, sometime after midnight, she woke to a sound. A slow, deliberate shuffling. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fan, but it was there, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. Sophia lay frozen, heart pounding in her chest as she strained to listen. It could have been an animal. The backyard bordered a wooded area. It wasn't unusual for raccoons or stray cats to wander through. But there was something about the rhythm of the steps, the way they paused and then continued, that didn't feel like an animal. It felt like a person. She reached for her phone, her fingers tightening around it as she debated whether to turn on the flashlight. But just as she was about to sit up, the footsteps stopped. Silence. For a long moment, she didn't move, barely even breathed. And then, cautiously, she climbed out of bed and padded toward the window. Peeling back the curtain just an inch, she peered outside. Nothing. The yard was empty. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting long shadows across the grass. But the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. The next morning, she found footprints in the dirt just outside her bedroom window. They weren't hers. The shape was different, larger, deeper, like someone had stood there for a long time, watching. Her stomach twisted as she crouched down, studying them. They led toward the back fence but disappeared before reaching it, as if whoever had been there had carefully retraced their steps. Her first instinct was to call the police. But what would she even say? That she heard footsteps in the night and found some footprints in the dirt? There was no crime, no proof of wrongdoing. It could have been anyone. Still, the unease lingered. Later that day, as she was bringing in a box from the car, she saw him again, her neighbor, standing on his porch, watching her. Only this time he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Sophia blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." His expression didn't change. This house, it's not for you. A cold chill crept up her spine. She forced herself to stay calm, to not let the tension show in her voice. I live here now. I just moved in. He didn't react, just kept staring for a long, uncomfortable moment before finally turning and walking back inside his house. Sophia exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around the box in her hands. Something was wrong here. That night, she double-checked the locks on every door and window before going to bed. But no matter how much she tried to rationalize things, to convince herself that she was just being paranoid, one thought kept repeating in her mind. Someone had been outside her window last night, and now her neighbor was telling her to leave. She didn't believe in superstitions, didn't scare easily. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake. That maybe, just maybe, this house was never meant to be hers. Sophia tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest, convincing herself that it was just the stress of moving. A new house, a new neighborhood, it was natural to feel on edge. The strange behavior of her neighbor was unsettling, sure, but it wasn't necessarily a cause for concern. Some people were just unfriendly, private, or unwilling to welcome new residents with open arms. That didn't mean there was anything sinister about him, but as the days passed, that feeling of unease only grew stronger. It wasn't just the way he stared at her from his porch, arms crossed over his chest, eyes never breaking contact. It was the way he seemed to always be there, no matter the time of day, no matter what she was doing. Whether she was bringing groceries inside, checking the mailbox, or even just sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, she would eventually feel that sensation of being watched, and sure enough, when she looked up, he would be there. Sometimes he would be standing by his window, barely visible through the sheer curtains. Other times he would be in his yard, pretending to check something on the side of his house, but his gaze was always pointed in her direction. She made a conscious effort to go about her days normally, pushing past the discomfort and focusing on settling in. There were still boxes to unpack, repairs to make, and a sense of normalcy to establish. But then, strange things started happening, things that made it impossible to ignore the nagging suspicion in the back of her mind. It started with something small. One morning, as she stepped outside to bring in a package, she noticed that her mailbox was open, its contents scattered across the ground. At first, she assumed it had been the wind, but when she bent down to gather the envelopes, she realized that some of them had been ripped open. Not just a single tear, not the careless damage of a rushed mailman, these were deliberately opened, the edges of the paper jagged and frayed. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she sifted through them, heart hammering as she checked for anything missing. Bills, junk mail, a letter from an old friend, nothing seemed stolen, but the invasion of privacy was enough to set her nerves on edge. She tried to brush it off, chalking it up to a nosy neighbor, maybe even kids messing around. But then, later that night, she discovered something even more disturbing. The house had come with an old security system, installed by the previous owners but never updated. She had planned to replace it with a more modern setup eventually, but for now she figured it would be enough to keep her aware of any movement outside. Except, when she checked the control panel before bed, she noticed that the cameras weren't working. Every feed was black, as if the signal had been cut. Her stomach twisted as she inspected the cables running along the side of the house, and sure enough, she found them severed. The clean cut of the wires sent a wave of unease washing over her. This wasn't a system failure. Someone had done this on purpose. She called the security company the next morning, arranging for a technician to come out and take a look. In the meantime, she started double-checking the locks on her doors, something she had never been particularly worried about before. But no matter how much she tried to maintain a rational mindset, the feeling that something was off refused to leave her. That evening, she decided to step into the backyard, partly to clear her head, partly to inspect the overgrown garden she had been meaning to clean up. The yard was bordered by a wooden fence, aged but sturdy, separating her property from the wooded lot behind it. As she walked along the edge of the fence, she noticed something unusual. One of the fence boards near the farthest corner of the yard was slightly loose. Not just from age or weathering, it had been moved recently. She reached out, nudging it, and it wobbled easily under her touch, as if someone had pried it loose from the other side. The discovery sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her, and she stepped back, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of place. The trees rustled in the evening breeze, the last traces of sunlight casting long shadows across the ground. But she could have sworn she heard something, a faint snap of a twig, just beyond the fence. Her pulse quickened. She stayed completely still, listening, waiting, and then, for just a split second, she saw a flash of movement between the trees. A dark silhouette shifting just beyond her field of vision. It was quick, barely there, but enough to make her blood run cold. Someone was watching her. She turned on her heel and rushed back inside, slamming the door shut behind her, locking it instinctively. Her hands were shaking as she pressed her back against the wood, heart pounding in her ears. Breathe, think. Don't panic. This wasn't a horror movie. She wasn't some helpless victim, but she also couldn't ignore what was happening. Grabbing her phone, she hesitated for only a moment before dialing the police. The call was brief. She explained the situation as clearly as she could. Her mailbox had been tampered with, her security system had been cut, and now she was certain someone had been outside her house, watching her from the trees. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, but there was something in their tone that made her stomach tighten. They weren't dismissing her concerns, but they weren't exactly treating it like an emergency either. "We'll send a unit out to check the area," the dispatcher said. "Stay inside, keep your doors locked." 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up in front of her house. She met the two officers at the door, recounting everything again, showing them the footprints she had seen near the fence, the damaged mailbox, the severed security wires. They listened, took notes, walked the perimeter of the house. But when they returned, their expressions were neutral. "We didn't see anything out of the ordinary," one of them said. "No signs of forced entry, no one lurking around. Could have been an animal." Sophia fought the urge to scoff. "An animal didn't cut my security wires." The officer nodded, as if conceding the point, but his posture remained relaxed, unconcerned. "It's possible someone was trespassing, but without any real damage or a clear threat, there's not much we can do. If it happens again, give us a call." The words settled uneasily in her chest. If it happens again, as if it was inevitable. She watched as they drove off, their headlights disappearing down the street, leaving her alone again in the growing darkness. Locking the door behind her, she exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just some drifter passing through, someone looking for an easy opportunity before realizing there was nothing worth taking. But deep down, she didn't believe that. Because when she passed by the front window, she saw him again, her neighbor, standing on his porch, watching her. And this time, when their eyes met, he did something he hadn't done before. He smiled. Sophia had spent years dealing with high-pressure situations, responding to medical emergencies where every second mattered, but nothing had ever made her feel the kind of slow, creeping dread that had settled in her chest now. The police had come and gone, dismissing her concerns with the same tired reassurances she had heard before. No signs of forced entry, no immediate threat, no action necessary. She had expected that response. But what she hadn't expected, what still gnawed at the edges of her mind, was the way her neighbor had stood there, after they left, watching her through the dark. The way he had smiled. It wasn't the kind of friendly smile a neighbor gave when welcoming someone new to the block. It was something else. Something knowing, almost amused. And she couldn't shake the feeling that he had been waiting for her to react, waiting to see what she would do next. For the next few days, she forced herself to stay busy, convincing herself that normalcy was the best way to push past whatever was happening. She repaired the loose fence board, installed new locks on her doors, and finally set up a modern security system with motion sensors, floodlights, and cameras that fed directly to her phone. This time, the wires were hidden inside the walls, impossible to cut without breaking into the house itself. If someone was coming onto her property, she would know. But even with those precautions in place, sleep didn't come easily. Every night, she found herself lying awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound of footsteps that might never come. And then, on the fourth night, it happened again. It started the same way, an uneasiness that pulled her from sleep, her body reacting before her mind fully caught up. The house was dark, the only light coming from the glow of the security panel on the wall. For a moment she thought it was just paranoia, the lingering effects of the last encounter playing tricks on her mind. But then, her phone buzzed. A motion alert. Her breath caught in her throat as she grabbed it, fingers swiping at the screen. The live camera feed opened instantly, and her stomach dropped. The backyard. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by shadows, motionless. The floodlights had activated, casting a bright halo of white light around the yard, but whoever was out there remained just outside its reach. Sophia felt her pulse in her throat as she stared at the screen, waiting for them to move, to do something, but they didn't. They just stood there, as if they knew exactly where the camera's range ended. Her hands tightened around the phone, and she fought the urge to act on instinct, to run outside and confront whoever it was. But she wasn't that reckless. Instead, she reached for the bedside drawer, pulling out the heavy flashlight she had started keeping next to her bed. Quietly, carefully, she moved through the house, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. The air felt thick, charged, as she approached the back door. She took a breath, then flicked the porch light on. Nothing. The yard was empty. Her eyes darted to the phone again, checking the timestamp on the footage. 30 seconds ago. The person had been there 30 seconds ago, standing in that exact spot, but now, gone. Her stomach twisted. There was no way someone could have disappeared that quickly. The yard was enclosed, the only exits being the locked gate and the thick forest beyond the fence. And yet, when she stepped onto the porch, the night was still and empty, as if no one had ever been there at all. She didn't sleep after that. She spent the rest of the night watching the cameras, waiting for another alert, another glimpse of the intruder. But nothing else happened. The sun eventually rose, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, and she felt the first sting of exhaustion settle behind her eyes. But even as she forced herself to go about her day drinking coffee, responding to messages, pretending everything was fine, her mind kept circling back to that moment. Had they seen the camera? Had they wanted her to see them? The next morning she found something new. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, a slight shift in the dirt near the fence, a small indentation where the grass had been pressed down. But when she crouched, running her fingers along the disturbed earth, she realized what it was. Footprints. Deep, deliberate footprints leading up to the back of the house. Her breath caught as she traced the path they took. They started near the trees, moving toward the porch, toward her bedroom window before stopping abruptly. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, as if whoever had made them had carefully retraced their steps. The realization sent a cold shudder down her spine. They hadn't just been standing in the yard. They had been walking toward her window, standing close enough to see inside, and then for whatever reason they had stopped. She forced herself to stay calm, to think logically. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe she was letting her paranoia get the best of her. But deep down she knew better. That was when she saw it. Something small, almost imperceptible, tucked against the wooden slats of the porch. A folded piece of paper, wedged carefully between the boards. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, unfolding it with careful, deliberate movements. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and the writing inside was jagged, written in thick black ink. Eve. The letters were uneven, as if they had been scrawled in a hurry, the ink bleeding slightly into the fibers of the paper. There was no signature, no indication of who had written it, but the message was clear. Someone wanted her gone. For the first time since moving in, she felt afraid. Not just unsettled, not just wary, truly afraid. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor. This wasn't just an overactive imagination. Someone had been outside her window. Someone had been watching her. And now they were leaving her messages. The rational part of her mind told her to call the police again, to report the note, the footprints, the late-night figure in the yard. But she already knew what they would say. No real crime had been committed. Just another warning to stay alert, another reassurance that they would patrol the area, but what if next time, whoever was out there did more than just watch? She wasn't going to wait to find out. Sophia spent the next few hours making calls, setting up appointments, gathering everything she needed to reinforce her home. New locks, stronger bolts, shatterproof window film, a reinforced security door. It was extreme, maybe even excessive, but she didn't care. By the time night fell, she felt marginally safer. But as she locked the last door and checked the cameras one final time, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Because when she glanced toward the house next door, toward the porch where her neighbor usually stood, he wasn't there. The porch light was off. The curtains were drawn. And somehow, that scared her even more. Sophia had always believed that fear was something that could be controlled, managed, and rationalized. It was an instinct, a response to danger, but it wasn't meant to take over. That was what she had always told herself. But now, standing in her own living room with every door locked, every security measure in place, and still feeling unsafe, she was beginning to understand that fear didn't work that way. It wasn't just about what was real, it was about what could be real. And right now, every shadow outside her window, every creak in the house, every flicker of movement on the security feed sent a fresh wave of unease rolling through her. Something was happening, something deliberate, and the worst part was that she still didn't know why. The note had changed everything. Before, she could tell herself that she was overreacting, that she was imagining threats where there were none, but someone had taken the time to leave a message, and that meant there was intent behind all of this. Whoever had been outside her house the past few nights wasn't just some trespasser or prankster. They were trying to scare her. Or worse, they were warning her. But from what? The neighbor's absence wasn't helping. Ever since she had moved in, he had been a constant presence watching her, observing her every move. It had been unnerving, even infuriating at times, but at least she had always known where he was. Now, for the first time, he was gone, and somehow, that was more unsettling than anything else. His porch light, which had always been on at night, remained dark. No movement behind the curtains, no sound from inside. It was as if he had disappeared entirely. She debated whether or not to knock on his door, to confront him directly, to demand to know what he had been watching for. But the idea of stepping onto his property, of putting herself in a situation where she might be cornered, made her hesitate. Instead, she decided to do something she should have done from the beginning. She started digging. The house had come with a thick folder of documents from the previous owners, everything from tax records to utility bills to neighborhood notices. She hadn't paid much attention to them before, assuming they were just the usual paperwork that came with buying a home. But now she was looking for something specific, something that might explain what was happening. It took hours. She sifted through pages of maintenance records, mortgage agreements, and renovation permits, finding nothing unusual. But then, near the bottom of the stack, she found something that made her pulse quicken. A property survey from 5 years ago, detailing the exact boundaries of her land. There was a note attached to it, handwritten in the margins. Disputed area fence moved back 10 feet. See legal inquiry denied. Sophia frowned, reading it over again. The words disputed area stood out, a small but significant clue. According to the survey, the back fence hadn't always been where it was now. It had been moved. And not just moved illegally. Someone had tried to reclaim that land, but their request had been denied. And then, just a year later, the previous owners had put the house on the market. She felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. What if that was what this was all about? What if someone, maybe the neighbor, maybe someone else, still believed that land belonged to them? That would explain why someone had been watching her, why they had left that note. They wanted her out. But even if that was the case, it didn't explain the fear that gripped her every night. It didn't explain why someone had been standing outside her window, why they had cut her security system, why her neighbor had suddenly vanished after watching her for weeks. She needed more information. The next morning, she drove to the county records office, hoping to find anything that could give her more context. The woman behind the desk was polite but distracted, barely glancing up as Sophia requested documents related to her property's history. It took nearly an hour, but eventually she was handed a stack of files, some of them old, yellowed with age, others more recent. She took them to a quiet corner and began reading. At first, it was just standard records: the original purchase, changes in ownership, zoning permits. But then she found something that made her breath catch. A complaint filed against the property. It was dated nearly 20 years ago and signed by someone whose name she didn't recognize. The complaint stated that the land behind the house had originally belonged to the family next door, that it had been taken from them without proper documentation, and that the owners at the time had built over a part of something that wasn't theirs. There was no resolution attached, no sign that the claim had ever been acknowledged or resolved, just a request for further investigation. And then, a few years later, another documented death certificate. The man who had filed the complaint was dead. Sophia stared at the paper, her pulse pounding in her ears. Had he died before the issue could be settled? Had it simply been buried under decades of other disputes, forgotten by everyone except those who still believed they had a claim? Or was there more to it? She glanced at the name again. And then, slowly, she pulled out her phone and searched for it. A news article popped up almost immediately. Local man found dead in wooded area near his home. No signs of foul play, authorities rule accidental. There was a photo attached. An older man, graying hair, deep lines etched into his face. And next to him, in the background of the picture, her neighbor. Sophia's breath hitched. The man who had been watching her, standing on his porch, observing her every move. He had known this man. She closed her eyes, trying to piece it together. The land dispute, the death, the way her neighbor had been keeping an eye on her house like he was waiting for something. And now, after all this time, someone was trying to scare her away. This wasn't just about property. It was about something buried here. And for the first time since she had moved in, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the truth. But she knew one thing. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Sophia sat in her car outside the records office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The article on her phone remained open, the image of her neighbor in the background burning itself into her mind. This wasn't a coincidence. He had known the man who had once fought for this land, the same man who had been found dead under circumstances that, at the time, had been ruled an accident. But what if it wasn't? What if there had been something more? What if someone had made sure that complaint was never resolved, ensuring that the land would remain exactly as it was buried beneath paperwork? Forgotten. And now, all these years later, she had moved in, unknowingly stirring up something that had been left untouched for too long. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Her first instinct was to drive straight to her neighbor's house, to demand he tell her exactly what the hell was going on. But she forced herself to stop and think. He had been watching her from the start, never engaging, never speaking beyond his cryptic warning that she shouldn't be here, and then, suddenly, after she reported the intruder, after she found that note, he vanished. That wasn't normal. That wasn't just paranoia. That was someone avoiding something. Which meant if she went to his house now, if she confronted him with everything she had found, she might not get the answers she was looking for. Or worse, she might get them in a way she wasn't prepared for. Instead, she went home, locking the doors behind her the moment she stepped inside. The silence of the house pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. Every time she moved, the floorboards groaned beneath her feet, making her hyper-aware of how alone she was. She checked the security cameras, scanning every angle of the property. Nothing. The backyard was still, the fence untouched, the trees swaying lazily in the afternoon breeze. But that didn't make her feel any better. Because she knew whoever had been out there wasn't just going to stop. They had left a warning for a reason, and she had ignored it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of restless energy. She tried to distract herself, throwing herself into anything that would keep her mind occupied, organizing the kitchen, fixing a loose cabinet door, even patching up a crack in the bedroom wall she had barely noticed before. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know. Night fell, and the tension only grew. She didn't turn off the lights when she went to bed. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every tiny noise the house made. At some point, exhaustion took over, and she drifted into a restless sleep. And then she woke up. At first, she didn't know what had startled her. The room was dark, the air thick with the stillness of the early hours before dawn. But something was wrong. Something felt wrong. She sat up slowly, blinking against the darkness, straining to hear. And then, from outside, near the back of the house, a sound. A faint scraping, low and deliberate. Her stomach clenched. It wasn't like the rustling of leaves or the distant creaking of a fence. It was something closer, something intentional. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled up the security feed. The cameras flickered to life, displaying the live footage of her property. And then her breath caught in her throat. Someone was at her back door. A figure stood just beyond the glass, barely illuminated by the glow of the porch light. They were facing the door, motionless, as if waiting for something. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she stared at the screen, her mind racing through every possible scenario. Did they know she was watching? Were they testing the lock? Were they going to try to come inside? Her fingers hovered over the emergency call button, but before she could press it, the figure moved, not toward the door, toward the camera. A slow, deliberate turn of the head, as if they knew exactly where it was. And then, they smiled. The motion sensor light flickered slightly as the figure stepped closer, just enough for her to make out the details. A man, mid-50s, maybe older. Scruffy beard, clothes that looked like they had been worn for too many days in a row. But the worst part wasn't the way he smiled. It was the fact that she recognized him. It was the man from the old news article. The man who had been found dead years ago. Her stomach turned to ice. No. That was impossible. It had to be a mistake. A coincidence. A trick of the light. But then, as she watched, he raised his hand slow, almost casual, and placed it flat against the glass of the door. And that's when she saw it. The scar. A deep, jagged line running from the base of his palm to his wrist, exactly like the one in the photo from the article. Her entire body went numb. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a trick. It was him, and he was alive. Sophia didn't hesitate. She pressed the emergency call button, her voice steady even though every part of her was screaming. The dispatcher answered almost immediately, and she forced herself to stay calm as she gave her address, explaining that there was an intruder at her back door. The woman on the other end of the line remained professional, assuring her that officers were on their way. But Sophia barely heard her, because the moment she spoke the words, "There's a man outside," the figure on the screen moved again, his hand lowered. His head tilted slightly, as if he was listening, and then, without breaking eye contact with the camera, he stepped back into the darkness. Gone. The only evidence that he had ever been there was the faint, ghostly imprint of his palm against the glass. By the time the police arrived, there was nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to prove that anyone had ever been there at all. But Sophia knew the truth. Someone had wanted her to see him. And now, there was no turning back. Sophia had always believed that reality was something fixed, something solid. But now, as she stood in her own living room, staring at the security footage of a man who had been declared dead years ago, she felt that certainty began to crack. The police had come and gone, their skepticism barely concealed behind forced professionalism. No forced entry, no signs of anyone lingering nearby. They had checked the perimeter, shined their flashlights into the trees, and then given her the same reassurances they always did call us if anything else happens, as if this were just another ordinary case of a nervous homeowner imagining things in the dark. But Sophia knew better. She had seen his face, had watched as he pressed his hand against the glass, as if confirming that she was real, as if letting her know that he wasn't some fragment of her imagination. And that meant that everything she thought she knew about what was happening here was wrong. Sleep was out of the question. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of her, her laptop open but untouched. She kept checking the cameras, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. But nothing happened. It was as if he had never been there. But he had. And that meant he could come back. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys before she forced herself to type his name into the search bar again. She had read the article before. had seen the old photos, but she needed to look at it with fresh eyes. She needed to find something she had missed. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs detailing how John Mercer, 56, was found dead in a wooded area behind his home late last year. No signs of foul play. Authorities suspect exposure due to the cold. She stared at the words, feeling a strange sense of detachment. No signs of foul play. Was that really true? Or had it just been easier to say that, to file it away as an unfortunate accident rather than dig deeper? She scrolled further, looking for anything in obituary, a funeral notice, something that would confirm that this man had actually been buried, that a body had been put into the ground. But there was nothing. Just the same vague details repeated in different sources, all of them saying the same thing: found dead in the woods, no further investigation necessary. She closed the laptop, her pulse hammering. Her neighbor had known Mercer. That much was clear from the old photos. And then, just as Sophia started asking questions, he had disappeared. Had he known what was coming? Had he left because he had seen Mercer too? Or had he been taken out of the picture because he knew something he wasn't supposed to? A cold shiver ran down her spine. Her thoughts kept circling back to that property dispute, the one Mercer had filed years ago. He had claimed the land had been taken from his family, that the fence had been moved illegally. The claim had never been resolved. And then, one day, he had been found dead. And now, after all these years, she had moved into his house, onto his land. And now, he was back. She forced herself to take a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the ceramic mug in front of her. If Mercer was alive, if he had somehow survived, somehow faked his own death, then why the warnings? Why the note? Why the silent visits in the dead of night? If he wanted her gone, why not just break in, threaten her outright? Why play these games? Unless a sick realization settled in her stomach. Unless it wasn't Mercer who had left that note. She turned her head sharply, looking toward the back door where he had stood just hours ago. Had he been trying to warn her? Had he come back not to chase her out, but because he knew something she didn't? The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through her, and suddenly sitting here wasn't an option anymore. She needed answers, and there was only one place she could think to find them. The woods. The place where Mercer had supposedly died. The place where he had been found. Or maybe, where he had never left. She pulled on a jacket, laced up her boots, and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. She wasn't going to wait for another visit. She wasn't going to sit here, helpless, wondering when he would come back. If Mercer was out there, if he was still living in those woods, then she needed to see it for herself. The night air was cold, pressing against her skin as she stepped onto the porch. The world around her was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that made every step sound too loud, too deliberate. She moved toward the fence, the one that had been moved all those years ago, the one that had caused this whole mess in the first place. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, stepping onto the narrow dirt path that led toward the trees. The further she walked, the more the house disappeared behind her, swallowed by darkness. She moved carefully, her flashlight cutting through the thick shadows, illuminating the uneven ground beneath her feet. The air smelled damp, earthy, the scent of decaying leaves and wet soil. And then, up ahead, she saw it, a structure. Not a house, not a cabin. Something smaller. A shed, maybe. Or a shelter. A place that looked like it had been lived in. Her breath caught as she stepped closer, the beam of her flashlight revealing more details. The wood was old, warped by time and weather, but the door was reinforced, stronger than the rest of the structure. Like someone had fortified it. She reached out, hesitating only for a second before pressing her palm against the wood. The surface was rough beneath her fingers, the scent of damp rot thick in the air. And then, from inside, she heard movement, a shuffling sound, slow, deliberate. Someone was in there. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stepped back, her instincts screaming at her to run, to turn around and get the hell out of there. But she forced herself to stay. She had come this far. She had to see this through. Taking a breath, she reached for the handle. And then, before she could react, the door swung open from the inside. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the darkness, his face hidden in the shadows. But she didn't need to see his face to know who it was. John Mercer. Standing in front of her, very much alive. Sophia's grip tightened around the flashlight, her mind racing through 1,000 different thoughts at once. But before she could say a word, before she could demand answers, Mercer spoke first. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in a long time. Sophia swallowed hard. "Neither should you." He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "You don't understand what's happening, do you?" She shook her head slowly, her heart hammering. "Then explain it to me." For a long moment, he was silent. And then, finally, he stepped out of the doorway, his face coming into view. There was something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. Not fear, not anger, but warning. "You need to leave this place," he said. Before they come back, Sophia's blood turned to ice. "Who?" she whispered. Mercer's jaw tightened. "The people who buried me." Sophia had expected a lot of things when she moved into this house: adjustment pains, maintenance issues, maybe even a difficult neighbor or two, but she had never imagined standing in the middle of the woods, face to face with a man who was supposed to be dead. John Mercer's presence was impossible. A direct contradiction to everything she had read, to everything the police had said, to every official record that confirmed his death as a matter of fact. And yet, here he was, his breath visible in the cold air, his expression worn with something between exhaustion and urgency, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than he could bear. The shed behind him was proof enough that he hadn't been far all these years, that he had been here, watching, moving through the trees, living like a ghost just outside the edges of her life. Sophia felt her pulse in her throat, her mind racing as she processed his words. Before they come back, it wasn't a warning that she had expected. She had thought he might threaten her, that he might tell her to leave because he wanted this land for himself, that this was about the property and the old dispute and the years of resentment that must have built up in his absence. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't about him wanting her gone. This was about something else wanting him gone. "Who?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended, the cold biting at her skin as she forced herself to stay rooted in place. Mercer's jaw tightened as he turned his head slightly, scanning the dark woods behind them like he was listening for something, like he expected someone to emerge at any moment. "They were supposed to forget about me," he said finally, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken to another person in years. "And they did. For a while, but now you're here, asking questions, digging." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's why they'll come back. Because they don't know how much you know, and when they don't know something, they don't take risks." Sophia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Who are they?" Mercer hesitated. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, as if deciding whether she was worth telling the truth. "The ones who buried me," he said finally. "The ones who tried to bury the truth with me." Sophia's grip on the flashlight tightened. She had spent the last few days trying to understand what was happening, trying to make sense of why someone was trying to scare her off this land. But now, she wasn't sure if it was about the land at all. Mercer took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "They needed me gone. Back then, it was easy. An accident. No investigation. No one cared enough to look deeper. But you," he shook his head, "you don't even realize what you've stepped into, do you?" She swallowed hard. "Then tell me." His expression darkened. "If I do, you won't be able to walk away." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver through her, but she had come too far to back out now. "I'm already in this. I need to know." Mercer exhaled, glancing over his shoulder again before turning back to her. "It wasn't just the land," he said. "That's what I thought too at first. But it was bigger than that. They weren't worried about a property line. They were worried about what was underneath it." Sophia frowned. "Underneath?" "The land was marked for development years ago," Mercer explained. Quietly. "No announcements, no permits on public record, nothing that could raise suspicion. But they sent surveyors out here, more than once. I saw them. And then one day they stopped coming. That's when the threats started." Notes. Warnings. The same kind they left for you. He studied her for a moment. They didn't want me to sell. They didn't want me to leave either. They wanted me to disappear. Sophia's stomach twisted. So they killed you. Mercer gave a hollow, humorless laugh. They tried. She felt her heartbeat quicken as she tried to piece it together. What's under the land? His jaw tightened. I never found out. But they were willing to kill for it. A distant crack echoed through the trees, sharp enough to make both of them freeze. It could have been a branch breaking under the weight of the wind. Or it could have been footsteps. Mercer's entire body tensed, his eyes locking onto hers. They're here. Sophia's breath caught. She had spent the past week feeling like she was being watched, like something was creeping just out of sight, like someone was waiting for her to cross a line she hadn't even known existed. And now, standing in the dark with a man who had already been buried once, she understood that she had crossed it the moment she refused to leave. Mercer grabbed her wrist, pulling her sharply toward the trees. We have to move. Now. She didn't argue. She ran. The woods were thick, branches whipping against her face as they moved blindly through the undergrowth. Behind them, she heard it again movement. More than one person. The sound of feet crashing through leaves, closing in too fast. Mercer swore under his breath, yanking her off the path, pulling her deeper into the trees, his grip like iron. A gunshot rang out. Sophia flinched, her body reacting before her mind caught up, ducking as Mercer dragged her behind the trunk of a fallen tree. Her pulse was a wild drumbeat in her ears, her breathing too loud, too fast. The shot had come from behind them. Too close. They won't let you leave now, Mercer murmured, his voice low. They don't need to scare you anymore. Sophia pressed her back against the rough bark, her mind racing. Why? Why now? And then she realized. It wasn't just about her asking questions. It was about Mercer being seen. They had left her warnings, but they had left him dead, and now she was proof that he wasn't. Mercer cursed under his breath. Listen to me. There's a road about half a mile west of here. If you can get to it, you might have a chance. Sophia's head snapped toward him. What about you? A second gunshot cut through the air, this time hitting the tree just behind them. Splinters of bark rained down as Sophia's breath hitched. Mercer grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. You need to go. I'm not leaving you. They're here for me, he said. If you stay, you die too. Sophia clenched her jaw. Everything in her screamed that this wasn't right, that she couldn't just run, that she couldn't just leave him here to die again. But then he pushed her. Hard. To go. Her feet moved before she could think, her body launching forward as she tore through the trees, the sound of gunfire behind her, Mercer's form disappearing into the darkness. She ran until the forest broke, until she stumbled onto the cold pavement of an empty road, until headlights blinded her and brakes screeched and someone was yelling. The last thing she saw before the world blurred was the dark outline of men moving through the trees. And then everything went black.